6:10 a.m., December 7th, 1941. The Pacific is calm, almost unnaturally so. Aboard the Japanese midget submarine I-20, Commander Hiru Sasaki peers through the periscope toward Pearl Harbor. Then he freezes. There's something wrong. Towering above Battleship Row is a vessel he's never seen. Longer than any cruiser, taller than a battleship, its deck lined with strange, angular aircraft glinting in the morning light. It isn't smoke or mirage. It's real. He adjusts the lens, breath tight in his throat. The ship's hull reads, USS Gerald R. Ford. It means nothing to him. The name isn't in any intelligence file. But what he's looking at shouldn't exist. Inside the harbor, sailors pause mid-duty, pointing toward the massive silhouette. Even the USS Arizona's watchman can't explain where it came from, or how it appeared overnight without a single naval record. For one surreal minute, the harbor holds its breath. Then radar picks up something else. Movement fast and low, a formation of dots streaking toward Oahu from the north. They don't know it yet, but the world's most advanced warship has just appeared on the worst morning in American history. You're watching Wars and Myths, and these are the war stories they never told in school. Before dawn broke over Hawaii, the Pacific War hadn't officially begun. To most Americans, the ocean still felt like distance, a blue wall separating them from Japan's ambitions. But beneath those calm waters, the Imperial Japanese Navy was already moving. 6 carriers, 353 aircraft, and one simple mission: cripple the U.S. Pacific Fleet before it could ever fight back. The plan was daring, even reckless. Japan's high command knew that without oil, steel, and rubber from Southeast Asia, their empire would collapse within months. But to seize those resources, they had to buy time, and that meant knocking America out of the war on day one. That's why, just after 6 a.m., Japanese submarines crept toward Oahu. Their task was to clear the way for the air assault that would follow an hour later. Except this time, something else was already waiting. A ship none of their intelligence reports accounted for. The USS Gerald R. Ford wasn't a battleship, or even a conventional carrier. It was a floating paradox. 100,000 tons of future steel sitting in a world still powered by diesel and piston engines. Its deck stretched longer than the Empire State Building was tall. Its tower bristled with radar arrays decades ahead of anything that existed in 1941. But its most terrifying weapon wasn't what it carried. It was what it represented. A glimpse of 21st century warfare dropped into the heart of the 20th. In 1941, radar was crude, experimental, and unreliable. The Americans on Oahu had only a handful of stations, most of them staffed by trainees. When one of those radars picked up the incoming Japanese strike at 7:02 a.m., the warning was dismissed as friendly bombers from California. That single mistake sealed Pearl Harbor's fate, but if the Gerald R. Ford really stood in that harbor, with its SPY-3, phased array radar and digital combat systems, the picture would have looked different. Its sensors could have mapped the entire Japanese formation 200 miles away, tracked every aircraft, and locked every incoming target before the first bomb fell. Imagine the confusion from the Japanese pilots when their radar detectors and a built for the faint signals of primitive ships suddenly lit up with data they couldn't interpret. The Ford's radar signature alone would have looked like something from another world. Still, advanced technology alone wouldn't guarantee survival, because even if the Ford could detect the attack, it faced another more brutal limitation: the world around it. No satellite network. No GPS, no compatible refueling infrastructure, no ammunition it could restock, no parts to repair the systems that powered it. Every single mechanism on board, from its electromagnetic catapults to its nuclear reactors, depended on a global supply chain that simply didn't exist in 1941. In other words, the Ford had power beyond imagination, but it was stranded in a century that couldn't sustain it. That's the paradox that makes this scenario haunting. You could place the most advanced carrier on Earth in the middle of the Pacific War, and it would still be fighting a world that didn't understand it, couldn't support it, and might eventually destroy it from within. Still, even in isolation, its presence would alter everything. Japanese submarines would struggle to get a radar fix. The Ford's stealth hull and heat signature management would make it nearly invisible to 1940s detection methods. Meanwhile, its onboard computers could calculate trajectories and intercept points faster than entire divisions of analysts. At that moment in history, Japan's plan relied on surprise. But with a modern supercarrier in the harbor, surprise dies first. 7:48 a.m. The first wave of Japanese aircraft crossed Oahu's northern coast. 90 minutes of devastation were about to begin. Except this time, one ship wasn't caught off guard. From the command deck of the USS Gerald R. Ford, Captain Rebecca Cole watched radar screens fill with hundreds of fast-moving blips approaching from the northwest. Each track was color-coded by altitude and speed, something that wouldn't exist for another 80 years. The Ford's AI-driven Combat Direction Center automatically classified them. Type 97 carrier attack aircraft. Altitude 3,000 feet. The crew didn't understand how the system knew those names. Some still thought the interface was reading from a simulation, but there was no simulation now. Cole ordered the alert level raised to Condition 1. Every defense system on the ship powered up, drawing from the twin nuclear reactors humming deep within the hull. A 21st century carrier had just gone to battle in 1941. Below deck, sailors on the USS Arizona and Oklahoma were still preparing breakfast. They heard the sirens and the engines before they saw anything. Then came the first explosion, a Japanese torpedo slamming into the West Virginia. Columns of water and smoke erupted across Battleship Row. For the Japanese pilots, it was supposed to be easy. No American planes in the sky, no active radar defense, no anti-air coordination. A perfect first strike, except now. Something else rose behind the smoke, a massive silhouette. Flat-topped, angular, bristling with turrets and glowing red from the heat of missile launches. The Ford's radar-guided CIWS close-in weapon systems erupted, unleashing streams of 20mm tungsten rounds that tore through the first formation of torpedo bombers. Pilots who had trained for years to strike immobile targets suddenly found themselves flying into a storm of precision fire they couldn't comprehend. The Japanese commander, Fuchida Mitsuo, circled high above in his Nakajima B-5N2 bomber. Through the canopy, he saw what he thought was an experimental American dreadnought. His radio crackled with confusion, reports of anti-air fire that seemed to track every plane with impossible accuracy. He didn't know it yet, but the Ford's defensive grid was running algorithms that could predict aircraft trajectories in milliseconds. Every plane that came within 10 kilometers was automatically assigned an intercept solution. On Oahu, soldiers at Fort Kamehameha scrambled to their posts, staring in disbelief as blue-white trails streaked across the sky. Missiles, guided, self-correcting, screaming toward the Japanese formation. The Ford's ESSM and RAM interceptors shredded the first wave before it reached Pearl Harbor. Out of 183 aircraft, less than 40 made it past the Ford's defensive perimeter. Those that did were met with chaos. The harbor already blanketed in radar interference, smoke, and shock waves. The Arizona still took a direct hit, her magazine erupting in a pillar of fire that shook the island. The Oklahoma capsized minutes later. But for the first time in this war that shouldn't be, the Japanese lost the element of inevitability. By 8:15, the second wave approached. Heavier bombers carrying incendiaries and armor-piercing ordnance. The Ford's deck crew moved in mechanical precision, launching F-35C fighters that, to 1941 eyes, looked like alien machines. Their afterburners split the dawn. Dogfights broke out over Honolulu, propeller-driven Zeros twisting against supersonic jets that left them frozen in the air. Radar-guided missiles found their marks before the Japanese could even turn. It wasn't a battle. It was dissection. Within 20 minutes, the sky was empty. The Japanese fleet, and still hundreds of miles away, received fragments of radio transmissions. Unknown ship. Immense firepower. Our formations are... Then silence. For Japan's command at sea, confusion turned to fear. They didn't know how America had built such a weapon. They didn't know that it wasn't meant to exist for another lifetime. All they knew was that their day of infamy had become the day they awoke a god of steel. Back in Pearl Harbor, survivors from the Nevada and California rode through oil-slicked water toward the Ford's shadow. The ship's hull towered above them, immaculate, untouched by fire. Some called it a miracle. Others whispered that it wasn't built by human hands, and somewhere deep inside its control room a quiet alarm pulsed. Low reactor coolant reserves. The ship had survived the first day, but its time in this world was running out. By the next morning, the smoke above Oahu had cleared. The attack had ended before it truly began. Photographs taken from reconnaissance planes showed a sight that defied logic. Japanese bombers scattered across the Pacific, debris fields stretching for miles. The American fleet at Pearl Harbor was bloodied, yes, but not broken. And towering above the wreckage was something that shouldn't exist. A single carrier, longer than the Empire State Building was tall, its flight deck scorched but intact, stood anchored offshore. Its hull markings read, USS Gerald R. Ford, CVN 78. In 1941, there was no CVN, no nuclear propulsion, no radar-guided missiles, no F-35s. The ship's very presence tore through the logic of history. Radio chatter that morning was chaos. Washington received reports that made no sense. A vessel unlike anything on record, automated gunfire, jets without propellers. They neutralized the Japanese attack almost entirely. Admiral Husband Kimmel, still reeling from the shock, demanded visual confirmation. When he finally arrived on site by patrol boat, he stared up at the Ford, its angular silhouette cutting the sunlight, its deck crawling with aircraft that no one could identify. He didn't speak for nearly a minute. Then quietly, God help us, and what have they built? News of the miracle ship spread through military channels faster than any radio could keep up. The Japanese command, and still operating under radio silence at sea, didn't yet know what had happened to their first and second attack waves. They'd lost over 300 aircraft and hundreds of pilots, the core of their naval air strength. When Fuchida's plane limped back toward the carriers, all he could say over the wireless was, "Impossible technology. Guided fire. Our bombs did nothing." Admiral Nagumo, realizing that surprise was gone, ordered the fleet to withdraw. For the first time in the war, Japan retreated from an offensive mission in confusion, not defeat. Meanwhile, on the other side of the world, intelligence networks in London, Berlin, and Moscow began intercepting American transmissions that mentioned a ghost ship. The British thought it was disinformation, an attempt to mask the losses at Pearl Harbor. The Germans didn't. Within hours, German Naval Command convened an emergency meeting. Reports from agents in Tokyo described a massive ship with weapons that used light and heat rather than gunpowder. The description fit no known design. Adolf Hitler reportedly dismissed it as a fabrication by the Americans to boost morale. But his inner circle, Goering, Dönitz, and Speer, took it seriously. If America had created such a ship, it meant one thing: they had leapt a century ahead overnight. Back in Hawaii, the U.S. Navy scrambled to make sense of what they had. Engineers boarded the Ford trying to understand its systems, but most of it was locked behind encrypted firewalls, coded AI systems, and digital access protocols decades beyond their comprehension. They could start the engines, they could launch aircraft, but they couldn't fully control it. The Ford was more than a ship. It was an ecosystem of future warfare. electromagnetic catapults instead of steam pistons, automated defense grids that tracked hundreds of targets simultaneously, stealth aircraft that could fly faster than sound, nuclear reactors that could run for 25 years without refueling. To 1941 eyes, it was science fiction come alive. President Roosevelt was briefed the following morning. The report was read twice to confirm accuracy. A carrier from no known registry, bearing American markings from 80 years in the future, had single-handedly repelled Japan's surprise attack. Casualty estimates were still high. The Arizona was gone, the Oklahoma lost, but Pearl Harbor itself remained operational. Roosevelt didn't believe in miracles. He believed in timing. And this, he realized, changed everything. He ordered the Ford to be placed under direct federal control. A small team of top physicists, including a young Robert Oppenheimer, was sent to Hawaii to examine its technology. They weren't told where it came from, only that it might hold the key to ending the war. In the Pacific, the Japanese Navy regrouped, haunted by what they'd seen. Rumors spread through the ranks and that America had built a sky fortress, that it was invincible, that it could see and strike from anywhere. Propaganda. Units called it aegiS ship, the vessel of the thunder. God. Pilots whispered that anyone who flew near it simply vanished. Fear began to do what no bullet had yet achieved. It broke their confidence. But back in Pearl Harbor, Captain Cole and her crew faced a different reality. The ship was still operational, but not indefinitely. Fuel reserves for the aircraft were low. Replacement parts didn't exist. Communications with the outside world were chaotic, since no 1940s radio frequencies could handle the Ford's encrypted systems. They were a ghost fleet, surrounded by allies who barely believed what they were seeing. In a war that hadn't yet caught up to their existence, Cole knew the truth. Her ship could win any battle, but it couldn't win the war alone. Every missile fired was one they couldn't replace. Every flight hour burned fuel they could never refuel. And every secret the world learned about them made their future more impossible to protect. By Christmas 1941, the world had changed. Japan's expansion slowed. Hitler grew paranoid, and somewhere in the Pacific, the most powerful ship ever built floated quietly in anchorage. A visitor from a war that hadn't yet begun, staring across the ocean at a past it could no longer escape. When the Gerald R. Ford arrived, or rather appeared in 1941, the war had been brutal but predictable. Battleships ruled seas. Dogfights were decided by eyesight and nerves. Commanders thought in miles, not data. The Ford shattered all of that in an instant. Captain Amelia Cole stood on her bridge, staring through binoculars at ships that belonged in a museum. Except they weren't. Battleships like the Nevada and Pennsylvania sat smoking in the harbor, their crews watching her carrier as if it were an apparition. Her sailors were no less shaken. They were trained for 21st century warfare, digital networks, precision targeting, and machine learning combat systems. But now they were operating in a time before even transistors existed. The air smelled of oil and salt, not jet fuel. The harbor buzzed with Morse code and shouted orders instead of encrypted comms. It was like waking up inside a black and white film. Only this one was real and deadly. Cole's orders were simple: survive, adapt, and avoid collapsing the timeline any further than it already had. But orders didn't cover the emotional weight of what her crew faced. Hundreds of sailors who suddenly realized that every person they met on shore had been dead for 80 years in their original world. Some handled it with quiet disbelief. Others began keeping distance from the locals, afraid to say too much or to change too much. Every night Cole walked the deck under blackout conditions, the Pacific breeze cutting through silence. Somewhere out there, history was still unfolding, and they were no longer part of it. From a tactical standpoint, The Ford's arrival was the single greatest disruption in naval warfare since gunpowder. Admiral Kimmel, once disgraced in the original timeline for failing to anticipate Pearl Harbor, now found himself studying the ship like a man trying to read the future. Its radar could sweep half the Pacific. Its aircraft could reach Japan and return the same day. Its weapons, missiles guided by invisible signals, could destroy targets the human eye couldn't even see. The Americans immediately began running simulations, crude tabletop war games, chalk on boards, calculating how this new weapon could change everything. The conclusions were staggering. With the Ford's strike range, the U.S. could cripple Japan's carrier fleet before Midway even happened. Its radar could make night attacks and surprise landings nearly impossible for the Axis. Its aircraft could eliminate the need for massive convoys or island hopping. But power like that came with a curse. The Ford's technology couldn't be replicated, not by 1940s industry. The U.S. didn't yet have the microprocessors, the software, or even the refined uranium to understand what made it run. Every button pressed on that ship risked draining systems that couldn't be replaced. Every sortie launched brought them closer to running out of the one thing war always devours. Sustainability. Cole called it tactical starvation. The Ford could fight any battle, but not an endless war. To the scientists examining it, the ship was a museum from the future. Oppenheimer's team, flown in under military secrecy, called it Project Anachron. Their early reports described technology that defied classification, alloys that didn't corrode, propulsion without exhaust, computers that thought faster than entire research departments. The Ford's AI systems, isolated by protocol, refused to share data with anyone who didn't have future-grade credentials. Even Cole couldn't override certain firewalls without triggering safety locks. So, to 1940s engineers, it was like staring into the engine of a god and realizing you didn't have the language to describe it. But what they could measure terrified them. The nuclear core produced energy levels greater than anything in the Manhattan Project's early projections. If replicated, even imperfectly, it could give the Allies a power source that changed not just the war, but civilization itself. The question was, no longer could they use it, but should they? In Tokyo, Admiral Yamamoto received the first confirmed photographs of the mysterious ship. Grainy black and white aerial shots showed a massive flat-topped vessel surrounded by a defensive haze, possibly heat shimmer, possibly something else. Intelligence officers analyzed the images, confused by the strange aircraft with no propellers and wings too short for glide flight. One advisor suggested it might be an experimental American prototype. Another said, half serious, "If this is real, we are already dead." The Imperial Navy's plan for Pacific dominance relied on timing, not numbers. But now, with one unknown ship capable of erasing entire air wings, their strategic timeline collapsed. Yamamoto, ever the realist, warned his subordinates quietly, "If the Americans truly possess such power, we cannot win this war." He wasn't wrong, but he didn't know how right he was. For Captain Cole, the moral dilemma deepened each day. Her crew could tip the balance of history. They could stop the Holocaust before it began, end the Pacific War in months instead of years, and save millions of lives. But doing so meant rewriting the world they came from, erasing everything, including themselves. The Ford wasn't built for conquest. It was built for deterrence, for a world that had already survived its last great war. Using it here meant unmaking that future. The world saw a weapon of salvation. Cole saw a paradox wrapped in steel. A ship that could win every battle but might destroy history itself in doing so. By spring 1942, the decision could no longer wait. The Pacific was calling. Japan was preparing its next offensive, and the impossible ship had to choose what kind of war it was truly fighting. By early 1942, Word of the Phantom carrier had reached every intelligence desk from Berlin to Tokyo. No one agreed on what it was. Some claimed it was an experimental battleship built in secret. Others whispered it was a weapon from the future. Whatever the truth, it had already bent the arc of history, and it was about to bend further. Captain Amelia Cole sat in on what historians would later call the Oahu Conference. Gathered around a table scarred by coffee rings and cigarette burns were men who'd only read about radar a year earlier, now being briefed on satellite guidance and thermal optics. General Short wanted to use the fort as bait, lure the Japanese fleet in, then obliterate it. Admiral Kimmel wanted to keep it hidden, a nuclear ace for the moment America truly needed it. President Roosevelt, listening over a scratchy, secure line, asked one question: if we use it once, will it still be ours the second time? Cole didn't answer. She couldn't guarantee the Ford would even survive a second engagement. Not physically and not chronologically. Every system was strained by the crude fuel and environmental conditions of 1941. Even her jet fighters required fuel the Navy couldn't produce, forcing engineers to mix experimental blends that burned hotter and corroded engines. She knew this. If the Ford became a public weapon, the war would end, and so would the world they were supposed to return to. In Tokyo, Yamamoto authorized a crash program to understand the ghost ship. Captured fragments of U.S. radio chatter mentioned nuclear and missile. Japan's scientists had no context, but they had resolve. Within weeks, prototypes of suicide torpedoes and manned rocket gliders appeared. Crude, unstable, but fueled by terror. German intelligence, alerted through the Axis alliance, sent its best minds to analyze intercepted data. Among them was a young Werner von Braun, who studied the fragments of English describing vertical launch systems and guided propulsion. Within months, the V-2 program received an unexplained acceleration order, history's first echo from a future that shouldn't exist. The Ford's presence didn't just change the Pacific War, it accelerated the entire global arms race by decades. Below deck, the sailors of the Gerald R. Ford were living through a paradox no manual prepared them for. Every broadcast they intercepted was history in progress. Names they knew from textbooks, Doolittle, Nimitz, MacArthur, were now living voices on the radio. Some crewmen began secretly sending Morse code messages to U.S. ships, warning them of upcoming attacks that hadn't yet happened. When Cole found out, she shut down all external comms for 72 hours. "No one plays God on my ship," she told them. But the damage was done. A PBY Catalina on routine patrol avoided a Japanese ambush because of one of those warnings. A single message had just changed the timeline. From then on, every action carried unbearable weight. Sleep grew thin. Fights broke out. The ship's chaplain started holding services not for faith, but for sanity. Oppenheimer's team, working out of a makeshift lab in Honolulu, had begun reverse engineering the Ford's power core. The physicists couldn't replicate it, but they could understand it. Within months, their notes quietly influenced a classified project in Los Alamos, years before it was supposed to exist. In another timeline, the Manhattan Project would have detonated its first atomic test in July 1945. Now, under the shadow of the Ford, that date had shifted forward to 1943. Cole saw what was coming. She realized her ship wasn't just defending the past, and it was arming it. That night, she entered a command override and encrypted every file related to the reactor, wiping backup schematics from the Ford's database. The AI resisted warning of data integrity loss. Cole ignored it. Her log entry was short. The future must earn its own fire. By the spring of 1942, the Battle of Midway loomed. In one reality, the U.S. would win by luck and intelligence. In this new one, they had a god machine floating off Hawaii. The Ford's fighters, F-35s now stripped of advanced sensors and guided manually by pilots trained on systems a century too modern, prepared for launch. The plan was simple: annihilate the Japanese strike force before it reached Midway. Cole hesitated. If they destroyed the entire Japanese carrier group, the Pacific War would end before Guadalcanal, before Hiroshima, before the Cold War. She looked over the flight deck at the horizon, calm, almost peaceful. "History wants blood," she said quietly, "but maybe it doesn't need ours." Instead of striking first, she ordered a defensive intercept, enough to protect Midway but not enough to rewrite the outcome. Her restraint preserved the rough shape of history, though no one would ever know. When the smoke cleared, the Ford began to fade, not from damage, but from time. Systems blinked out in sequence. Hull plating shimmered. Crewmen reported brief flashes of future memories and families, cities, peace treaties, and as though reality was resetting. By dawn, only a handful of witnesses on Midway claimed to have seen the floating city vanish into mist. The Pacific was quiet again. Historians later called it a myth. Classified files described it as an anomalous prototype. But for those who had stood on her deck, the truth was simpler. They had seen what war looked like when technology outran morality. The USS Gerald R. Ford never appeared in any official wartime record, but the ripples it left, the premature atomic tests, the accelerated radar systems, the sudden Allied confidence, and all hinted at something that didn't belong. History moved on. The war ended. But somewhere deep in the Pacific, beneath layers of myth and classified silence, the world's most advanced ship had already done what it came to do: remind humanity what kind of future it could lose. The USS Ford cuts through the Pacific like a blade, silent, unchallenged, and entirely wrong for 1941. Her radar lights up with signals decades ahead of their time. Lieutenant CMDR Hayes watches as strange blips move across the screen. Dozens of incoming aircraft. Tight formations closing fast. Must be a glitch, he mutters. The tech beside him shakes his head. No, sir. They're real. Up on deck, sailors spot the first glints in the distance. Black dots turning into wings, then into the unmistakable silhouettes of Japanese Zeros, except these aren't grainy museum photos. They're right there, screaming toward the harbor at 200 knots. For a split second, no one moves. History and reality are smashing together in real time. Then chaos. Sound general quarters. Sirens wail. The ship's automated defense system spins to life, rotating its CIWS turrets. Alien weapons to anyone watching from the shore. Japanese pilots, trained to attack 1941 battleships, suddenly face a machine from a future they can't comprehend. The Ford's cannons roar, not with shells but streams of supersonic tungsten. Planes disintegrate mid-air before they even reach their bombing runs. The harbor below erupts in confusion. From the Arizona's bridge, sailors stare skyward as fire rains down from an impossible century. Pearl Harbor burns, but not like the history books remember. Smoke curls above the bay, streaked with flashes of tracer fire too fast for the eye to follow. From the bridge of the USS Ford, Captain Hayes watches chaos unfold through a storm of radar echoes. His crew is trembling, not from fear but disbelief. Below them, the USS Arizona takes a direct hit. The explosion rocks the harbor, a shock wave that shatters windows across Ford Island. Hayes grips the railing, jaw clenched. "That ship," he mutters, "that ship isn't supposed to go down. Not this way." He makes a call no one in 1941 or 2045 would believe. "Bring the drones online. Target the fires. We're saving them." Bay doors hiss open. A swarm of compact firefighting drones, AI-guided and armed with suppressant foam, erupts into the air, descending over the inferno. Sailors below watch, jaws slack as silver machines hover through the smoke, snuffing out flames and lifting wounded men onto stretchers that glide across the water. In the chaos, one officer on the Arizona looks up through the smoke, eyes wide. What in God's name is helping us? And for a moment, the past believes it's being rescued by angels. Half a world away, Admiral Yamamoto stares at the latest reconnaissance photos with trembling hands. Grainy images show something impossible. A single vessel decimating aircraft, extinguishing fires, and rescuing sailors in ways no human mind could plan. Impossible, mutters a junior officer. They've reversed the tide. In the war rooms of Tokyo, panic spreads like wildfire. Commanders argue over intercepted radio chatter. Pilots reporting weapons they have never seen. Ships moving faster than physics should allow. Intelligence officers calculate, recalculate, then throw their charts aside. The Japanese Imperial Navy faces a paradox. The Americans are present, yet armed with tools from a century ahead. Every offensive plan is obsolete the moment it is drafted. Yamamoto, the master strategist, looks out at the harbor through a telescope. If this is true, we cannot win. Desperation sets in. Submarine captains hesitate. Carrier groups falter. The aura of invincibility that once defined the Japanese Navy begins to crack. Meanwhile, the USS Gerald R. Ford continues its calm but deadly ballet. A ship out of time, reshaping the battle before it even begins. Smoke curls across the harbor, curling like ghostly fingers as the first wave of Japanese aircraft retreats. But the calm is deceptive. A second surge appears on the horizon. Planes in numbers the crew of the Gerald R. Ford can barely count. Their formations shift, adapting faster than history ever recorded. Radar blips multiply. A chaotic symphony of enemy intent. Captain Cole tightens her grip on the console. If even one carrier slips through, we could still lose the battle, she mutters, eyes scanning every vector. The crew braces. The impossible unfolds before them. Lasers streak through smoke, slicing incoming ordnance. Automated drones hover overhead, extinguishing fires, lifting wounded sailors to safety. FA-18s and F-35s tear into the sky, intercepting bombers with pinpoint precision. A deadly ballet the Japanese pilots cannot anticipate. Every heartbeat matters. Every second is suspended between history as it was and history as it could be. They've survived the first onslaught, but what comes next could decide the fate of the entire Pacific. The second wave descends like a storm. 163 Japanese aircraft surge over the harbor, torpedoes slicing through the water toward Pearl Harbor. But the Gerald R. Ford is ready. Radar-guided missiles explode mid-air. Jets streak from the flight deck, breaking the sky with speed and firepower unseen in 1941. Smoke and debris swirl around the harbor, but firefighting drones move with quiet precision, extinguishing blazes before they consume ships. Underwater enemy submarines maneuver, but anti-submarine drones glide silently beneath the waves, hunting with terrifying efficiency. A torpedo detonates near the hull. A geyser of water erupts, but the Ford barely quivers. The crew watches, awed as the impossible becomes reality. History splits in two. One timeline remembers devastation. The other remembers a carrier that should not have existed, standing as a bulwark against the tide of war. Japanese commanders scramble. Morale shatters. One ship alone alters the course of history. The smoke lifts. Pearl Harbor looks different than history remembers. Fewer ships broken. Fewer lives lost. Sailors stare across calm waters, blinking at the impossible. The Ford stands proud, untouched by disaster. Japanese aircraft retreat disorganized, their offensive faltering. Victory is partial, but meaningful. Captain Cole walks the deck, observing her crew. As they assist in recovery, extinguish fires, and tend to the wounded, she makes a log entry, calm and measured. We've preserved lives, but the timeline is fragile. Every intervention carries weight. History is not ours to rewrite, only to protect. Slowly, the Ford begins to fade, returning to its own time. Sailors glimpse a legend that never existed, a vessel that shaped events they can barely comprehend. Its presence is fleeting, yet its impact ripples through memory. whispered among those who were saved, never fully recorded in history books. Pearl Harbor survives with new possibilities. Lives spared. Strategies changed. A future rewritten in subtle ways. The sun sets over Pearl Harbor. Calm replaces chaos. History remembers devastation. But the mind lingers on the impossible. A ship from the future, a guardian that never existed. What does it mean to wield power you were never meant to have? The USS Gerald R showed that even the greatest force cannot guarantee victory. Only the opportunity to make a difference. Every choice, every act of courage, defines history. Waves lap gently at the shore. If you love exploring unbelievable yet factual moments from history, and want more what-if scenarios like this, subscribe now and hit the bell to never miss a story that could have changed the world. The final image lingers. Calm water, whispering across a deck that never existed, yet changed everything.